You've probably looked at wrestlers' basics and selling ratings in TEW IX and thought, okay, but what does that actually mean? And there's something interesting. Basics and selling might look like two fairly straightforward wrestling skills, but they actually work in different ways. With basics, there's really an important threshold, and with selling, the quality of the match you're having can actually affect whether the selling level is good enough. And once you understand that, you can start using these stats much more effectively when you're booking. Welcome back to the TEW IX Handbook Explained series here on GS Gaming. This is the series where we're taking the official TEW IX Player's Handbook, breaking down the mechanics one at a time, and most importantly, working out what the information actually means when you're booking your own wrestling company. We've already looked at match ratings, popularity, psychology, and match aims, and momentum. And today we're looking at basics and selling. Let's start with basics. The handbook describes basics as measuring a wrestler's basic wrestling skills. So we're talking about their fundamental wrestling ability. But the important thing with basics isn't actually how high the number can get, it's the threshold. If a worker's basics is 40 or below, they're eligible to receive a penalty for not being properly grounded. So if you've got someone with 35 basics, that's something you need to be aware of. At 40, they're still within that threshold, but once they're above 40, the situation changes, because the handbook tells us there is no benefit to having a particular high basics value. So if one worker's wrestling is 45 basics and another with 85, I don't automatically consider the second wrestler better because of their basics. Both have passed the important threshold. The 85 doesn't give them an additional basics benefit, so the easy way to think of basics is below or at 40, pay attention. Above 40, move on and look at the rest of the worker. And I think that's an important lesson for TEW IX generally. Don't assume every stat is simply the higher number equals the better wrestler. Future Geordie here. I just want to take a moment to say thank you to all the continued support of the channel, and especially to everyone supporting me over on Patreon. I've honestly been blown away by the feedback I've recently received, and I'm really glad to hear that these videos are helping people understand TEW IX a little bit better. Speaking of Patreon, if you'd like to support the channel for just a few pounds, dollars, or whatever your local currency might be, there are a few things you can get in return. You'll get early access to every video before it goes live on YouTube, early access to the 2000 award mod I've been working on, spreadsheets, and plenty of upcoming content including TEW diaries and top tips videos. So if you'd like to support the channel and help me making this content that's there for you, I'm also really excited to say that I'll be joining the Grey Dog Software affiliate program. So if you're watching this and you haven't picked up TEW IX yet, I'll have a link in the description. If you do decide to buy the game through that link, it's another way you can support the channel, and I really appreciate it. But enough of that, let's get back to the handbook. Basics and development. There's also some useful information here if you're developing younger wrestlers. The handbook tells us that workers learn basics at a steady rate simply through having ring time. So if you've got someone with poor basics, that isn't necessarily something they're stuck with forever. They can develop it through working. And there's another important point. Basics does not decline with age. So an older veteran doesn't automatically lose their basic wrestling ability just because they're getting older. But when we move over to selling, things get a little more complicated. Selling is how well a wrestler sells the effects of moves and other physical punishment. Basically, how well do they make what their opponent is doing look like it's actually hurting? And unlike basic, there are several different things to understand about selling. First, if a worker has 40 selling or below, they're eligible to receive a penalty for poor selling in any match they wrestle in. So again, 40 is an important number. But this is where we need to be careful, because that's only part of the selling mechanic. The quality of the match itself also matters. This is probably the most important thing to understand about selling. The handbook tells us that the lack of selling penalty can occur when the average selling of all the wrestlers in the match is significantly lower than the match rating. At that point, the calculation is made. So selling isn't necessarily something you can judge in isolation. You have to think about it in context of a match you're asking the workers to have. Let's use an example. Imagine you've got a match that scores around 85. One of the wrestlers has 60 selling. Now 60 might look perfectly respectable number when you're just looking at their profile. But if you're asking that worker to be part of a very high quality match, that level of selling may not be enough to keep up with the level of the match. Now take the same wrestler, still with 60 selling, and putting them in a match that scores around 50. Suddenly the selling level is much more appropriate to the level of the match you're having. So The important lesson isn't 60 is bad. 60 selling may not be enough depending on the level of match you're asking the worker to have. And I think that's a really useful distinction. The worker's selling hasn't changed, the number is exactly the same, the context has changed. And there's another really important detail here. The handbook isn't simply checking one wrestler's selling against the match rating for the match level penalty. It looks at the average selling of all the competitors in the match. The calculation is generally the total selling divided by the number of competitors. That means one really strong seller can help compensate for weaker sellers elsewhere in the match. So imagine you've got a 4-person match, 3 workers have relatively average selling, and the 4th has exceptionally high selling. That strong seller can help raise the overall average. So you shouldn't necessarily look at the match and think everyone in this match needs fantastic selling. The overall selling level matters as well, and that's a really useful thing to know when you're putting a match together. And now we get to another important difference between basics and selling. The handbook tells us that a very high selling, 75 or above, can give a worker bonuses to their individual performance in a match. So selling doesn't just have a low end penalty, there's a potential benefit at the high end. Think about the difference. With basics, 40 or below can cause a problem. Above 40, there's no additional benefit from simply having a higher number. With selling, 40 or below can cause an individual poor selling penalty, but 75 or above can provide an additional performance bonus. And selling can also matter at match level because of the average selling compared with the match rating. So selling has considerably more going on than basics. Selling can also improve through working matches, but there's an interesting extra detail here. The handbook tells us that workers learn selling faster when they're in a match with someone who has a higher selling value. So let's say you've got a young wrestler who isn't very good at selling yet. If they're working with someone who's much better seller, that can help develop their skills faster. Now, if that doesn't mean you should put every developing worker with your best seller every single week, that's not what the handbook says. But it's useful information when you're thinking about developing your roster, because the matches aren't just about who wins and who loses. They're also opportunities for workers to develop their skills. There's another major difference between basics and selling. Remember, basics does not decline with age, selling does. The handbook tells us that selling degrades with age, although the decline is relatively slow compared to other skills. So if you've got a veteran who was once an exceptional seller, you shouldn't assume they'll retain exactly the same selling rating forever. It can gradually decline. And once again, this shows why you shouldn't assume all TEW9 skills work in exactly the same way. So let's put these two stats side by side. Imagine you've got 2 wrestlers. Worker A has 80 basics and 50 selling. Worker B has 50 basics and 80 selling. Which one is better? Well, we can answer that simply from those 4 numbers, but we can understand what the numbers are telling us. Both wrestlers are comfortably above the important basics threshold, so basics isn't really separating them, but worker B has 80 selling. That means they've reached the level where the high selling can produce an individual performance bonus. They also have selling value that can help overall average when you're working other wrestlers. Wrestler A doesn't have the same high-end selling advantage, so suddenly we understand the differences between the workers much better. And that's really the point. We're not just looking at which number is bigger, we're looking at what number actually does. So, if you're booking your own company, what should you actually do with this information? First, if you've got somebody with basics of 40 or below, that's something worth paying attention to. They have a potential penalty attached to their fundamental wrestling ability, but if they're above 40, you don't need to obsess over making that number even higher. Look at the rest of their profile. Selling is different. When you're looking at selling, don't just ask, are they good at selling? Ask, is this selling rating good enough for the match I'm asking the wrestler to have? That's a much better question. A wrestler with 60 selling might be perfectly fine in one match, but the same level of selling couldn't become an issue when you're asking them to work a much higher match level. And if you're booking several wrestlers together, remember the game also considers the average selling across the match. So a strong seller can potentially help compensate for weaker sellers. And if you've got somebody with 75 or higher selling, you've also got the potential individual performance bonus. That's a useful information when you're evaluating your roster. Let's say I'm booking a big main event. I've got 2 potential workers. Worker A has 60 selling, worker B has 85. And I'm expecting the match to be around a 50. Worker A's 60 selling isn't necessarily something that worries me, but if I'm building a match that I'm expecting to reach the mid 80s, I'm going to pay much more attention to the selling levels of everyone involved. And worker B's 85 selling is particularly valuable because they're above the 75 threshold for the individual performance bonus. That doesn't mean always book the 85 selling wrestler in the main event. That's not what the stat tells us. They might have weaknesses somewhere else. They might not have the psychology, the popularity, or might not be able to fit the right story. The point is, now I understand what the selling rating contributes to that booking decision, and that's how I want you to think about every stat we cover in this series. I think the biggest mistake a new TEW player can make with basics and sellers is treating both stats as simple numbers that can rank from lowest to highest. You can't. A basic rating of 80 isn't automatically giving them a benefit than a basic rating of 50. But an 80 selling rating can meaningfully different from a 50 selling rating because you've reached that high end bonus threshold. And selling can also interact with the quality of the match through the average selling level. So don't just look at the number, ask what does the game actually do with it? And how does that affect the match I'm trying to book? That's the useful information. So let's bring everything together. Basics measure basic wrestling skill, or at 40 or below, a worker is eligible for a penalty for not being properly grounded. Above 40, there is no additional benefit from simply having higher basics ratings. Basics improve through ring time and it doesn't decline with age. Selling measures how well a worker sells the effects of moves and physical punishment. At 40 or below, a worker is eligible for an individual poor selling penalty, but selling also has a match level effect. If the average selling of the match is significantly below the match rating, if the average selling of the workers in the match is significantly below the match rating, the match can receive a lack of selling penalty, and a high selling value can compensate for the weaker selling elsewhere in the match. Then at 75 or above, very high selling can provide an additional performance bonus. Selling also improves through matches, improves faster when working with someone who has higher selling value, and gradually declines with age. So if you remember one thing from today's episode, make it this. Don't ask whether a stat is simply good or bad. Ask what the game actually does with that number, and specifically with selling, whether the number is appropriate for the match you're asking the worker to have. And that's basics and selling in TEW9. And I actually think these two stats make a really good pairing because they demonstrate two different ways that TEW can use a wrestling skill. Basics is largely about clearing a threshold. Selling has a low end penalty, which match level consequences and potential benefits at the high end. And that's exactly why I combined them into one episode, because the point of this series isn't just learning what the numbers mean, it's understanding how to use them actually booking your company. Next time, we're moving on to the next mechanic in the handbook. But for now, if you're enjoying TEW9's official handbook, make sure you've subscribed to GS Gaming so you don't miss another episode, and give us a like. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you down the road.